Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arup K. Chatterjee, and I'm here to welcome you to another wonderful, hopefully, from the looks of it, episode of Legends of the Philosophy of Science. And I have with me a much more than wonderful guest. I'm indeed very privileged to have Professor Dr. Naresh Singh. Professor Naresh Singh is the Executive Dean of the Tyndall School of Government and Policy. He is the founding director of the Center for Complexity Economics and Applied Spirituality. That's a mouthful. Professor Naresh Singh, I'm also incredibly pleased to say, has had more than 4 decade, and I might be being rather modest about it, more than 4 decade journey across the United Nations Development Program and the federal government of Canada before he joined the OP General Global University, and that is only the surface. So I've barely scratched the surface in describing our very eminent guest here today, and I'm very pleased to say that I enjoy the colleagueship of Professor Naresh Singh as well in the university I teach. So, Professor Singh, what a wonderful experience to be sitting beside you in this podcast. And today we are going to talk about, as you have suggested, the dialectic between um, rationality and intuition. And we'll try to explore, uh, not answer, but simply try to pitch the question as to how we know what we know. So, is this ontology, epistemology? What is it, Professor Singh? And before that, why don't you tell us something about how how we approach the philosophy of science in India and globally today in the 21st century, and how do you think that is different from the time maybe when you started off?
Right. Well, first of all, let me thank you, Arup, for raising the opportunity of having this conversation. I've always enjoyed the engagement you've had with various of our colleagues, most notably Professor Sudhir Patra, and
Hmm.
your conversations in this series.
Hmm.
Um, well, what I really want to address, and including your question, is leading to public policy.
Mm.
In fact, I was just listening to a part of a talk by a former Director General of the Indian Statistical Institute talking about data driven policy. And it was interesting that his title was Data Driven Policy and not Evidence Driven Policy,
Mm.
because evidence would be broader than data.
Mhm.
And if we were to talk about evidence based policy, we would have to have in that equation data, information,
Mm.
knowledge, and wisdom.
Right.
The chances are we will have an overload of data.
Mhm.
The amount of data we have is, in fact, so big, we call it big data.
Mm.
And as you go down that spectrum, from data to information to knowledge to wisdom,
Mm.
you're going down and down.
Mhm.
By the time you get to wisdom, it's about zero
Mm.
in the public policy. That's the link. So, what is this wisdom then? That's the point about the philosophy of science.
Mm.
That's the point about Indian wisdom traditions and how and why might we take those insights, many of which are relevant in today's world,
Mm.
into account. So when we talk about, part of the title that we had originally discussed was the equations to poetry.
Yes. Yes. Indeed.
And so what we are talking about is probably well captured in a quote of attributed to Albert Einstein, but
Mhm.
the real author is apparently a guy called Bob Santos, who wrote a
Okay.
book on consciousness.
Okay.
But Einstein's thoughts were along the same lines, and of course, being such a famous person, it was attributed to him. And the quote is, we are all blessed with a rational mind,
Mm.
which is a faithful servant,
Mhm.
without which we couldn't do much,
Mm.
as well as with an intuitive mind, which is a sacred gift. That's how it is put. So the rational mind is a faithful servant. The intuitive mind, a sacred gift. All that is good. But the problem is that we have created a society in which the servant is the boss and the gift has been forgotten. In other words, we have overprized rationality in today's world. And that rationality we are talking about is scientific rationality. In other words, since the scientific revolution of Newton, Descartes, and Bacon, 400 years or so ago, the scientific method has been so powerful in generating information and indeed knowledge that virtually everything we have in the world today is driven by based on that scientific method. And so we reward our students, we are rewarded, everybody is, for what we call critical thinking and rational. If you're not rational, you're kicked out of the class, I guess. But we're now facing a world where that rationality has led us to understanding ourselves as separate from nature, for example. That rationality and that kind of knowledge and philosophical understanding figures that you and I are completely different individuals. So we have a separation of human to human and human from nature. And that has led us to a way of living that is subjugating nature, leading to overexploitation. And I don't have to list all the issues. It's become so, the impact of humans on the planet is so powerful that we call it the Anthropocene, the age of the domination of humans on nature. So that's the framing, of this rationality versus intuition, drawing from that quote. But we are not bringing much wisdom into the policy process, and we are busy using the approach of rationality, which is, I believe, no longer adequate. Yes, needed. I'm not throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater, but it has to be complemented by this more intuitive, I might say, consciousness-based understanding.
Right.
I will go so far as to call it applied spirituality, which I have done.
So that is uncannily interesting to me, Professor, because we seem to overlap in many of our ideas, regardless of what communication we've had, and we haven't really discussed uh, these things independently of this podcast. You might be aware, you may not, that I have done a lot of research on somebody called Sherlock Holmes.
Yes,
And Sherlock Holmes, who's a fictional character, but of tremendous historical importance, uh, refers to someone called William Tyndall, who was a real person, a scientist of the age of the great theories of evolution in the 19th century. And William Tyndall spoke about scientific imagination. And Sherlock Holmes, to most perceptions, is a very rational person, apart from his own perception, because he continuously tells Watson that I have an intuition. And of late, some people, including yours truly, is guilty of bringing this aspect of Holmes to certain eyes. That no, there is an intuitive side to Holmes. There is tremendous wisdom in Holmes. It is we who have only looked at the rational side because maybe we were barbarically rational in some ways, and that led to the Anthropocene. The reason why I bring in Sherlock Holmes is not just to promote my research in an obscene way, but to suggest that this fascination with data, this fetishization of data, if I may put it that way, that also goes on in the name of diversity. We try to de-establish the old order, and we say that we have new data, and this is a data-driven society. In your experience, Professor, do you think this has led to positive changes in the current demography in the 21st century students? Or do you think it is causing detrimental effects upon their intellectual minds? Do you think social media has any role to play in the promotion of this data driven, non wisdom oriented society? Or do you think social media can also be used in a fruitful, in a positive direction?
Mhm. There are two main things that come to mind as you pose that question. One is the inability these days of distinguishing between data that is scientifically derived
Mm-hmm.
and data that is opinion,
Yeah.
and a lot of it, as we all know, called fake news.
Yes.
So misinformation, and some of it, one might say disinformation,
Mm-hmm.
because of a deliberate attempt. Misinformation might be inadvertent,
Mm-hmm.
but some of it is deliberate falsification for mischief of various kinds. So both we have to deal with. The second one is clearly bad for young students, for any one of us, because it's deliberately designed to mislead.
Mm-hmm.
The but the overuse of data, we have to be careful here because it's a thin line. We should be able to, be allowed to, and be trained to have the capacity to use data effectively. It remains important.
Mm-hmm.
The over reliance, however, which I think is happening, the over reliance is the problem because the decisions we are making are based on this false premise. The first part of the falsity of the premise is that we think that we are a separate individual self
Mm-hmm.
running around on the planet,
Mm-hmm.
and all our purpose has to be is to satisfy our needs, and that alone would be bad enough. But we have now reached a point at which we have no ability to distinguish between wants and needs.
Mm-hmm.
We have made them the same thing. The result is whatever we dream of that our ego is driving us to want, we figure we need to have it and have it right away, and to hell with the consequences to others and to nature. So that inability, or that, in a way, lost wisdom of who we are,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm talking about answering the question posed by many in this country, starting maybe 2,500 to 3,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing who you are,
Mm-hmm.
and the Western science is now catching up with the understanding that we are not separate individual selves, also aka ego.
Mm-hmm.
When you inquire and you go through the process of really trying to figure out who you are
Mm-hmm.
by asking the question, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
It leads us to a place where you are not just a little organism like a little ant running around the planet trying to meet your basic needs. But it is indeed, you come to the place, the sages have used the approach called Neti-Neti, from the Sanskrit, not this, not that. You eliminate all that you are not until you are left at a very interesting place, which is nothing. That is what sometimes is called Shunyata, emptiness. But that emptiness, that nothing, is not nothing in our traditional sense. It's just no thing.
Yeah.
Or you're not an organism, an object. You come to the understanding that your true nature, your essence, is pure awareness,
Mm-hmm.
absolute consciousness. And now Western science, modern neuroscience, and so on, showing that the same insights are coming from Western science. One, that the individual self is non-existent. It's not there. Lots of literature. It was written in many books by many people. It, of course, started in Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta and so on. But the science is now showing the same thing. That I believe, that fundamental delusion, what one
Mm-hmm.
might call, Alan Watts in one of his books called it
Mm-hmm.
hallucination,
Yes.
that loaded with data
Mm-hmm.
becomes a massive explosion,
Mm-hmm.
an explosive that we don't know how to deal with. And that's what's going on now, I would say. So much so that we had to introduce new terms over the last 2 decades, like, these individual crises we have, like climate change, species extinction, economic inequality, social exclusion. It is now clear that these are all becoming entangled
Mm-hmm.
and so leading to what we had to use a new word called polycrisis.
Mm-hmm.
And now, because we have recognized that that fragmentation we see in the world
Mm-hmm.
and the crises we see in the world are actually reflection of the crisis we have in our consciousness,
Right.
that they had to then come up with another word called the meta crisis.
Mm-hmm.
How do we work with that and resolve that? I think it's a high priority research agenda
Mm-hmm.
for all of us.
Before I move on and ask you something a little more, a little more naughty. Naughty spelled as Knotty, not
I
the
got
other
you. I got
naughty.
you. Got you. Yeah.
Maybe I just wanted to ask you something about it. Glib, what do you think if we ask the question, does the individual matter at all? Is this a useful question in policy related matters, in school and university education? Do you think this question is valuable? Because a lot of people tend to, treat this question itself condescending. So you, as a person who's, internationally and renowned will not be an overstatement, who has worked with such, globally leading organizations, Professor, in that sense, because a lot of my colleagues, let's say people of my generation, might not find this question valuable enough for them. What do you think?
I think that yes, we as individuals is an important concept.
Yeah.
We are embodied,
Hmm.
and we can't forget that.
Right.
You and I will not be having this conversation if we were not embodied. We
Hmm.
will just be what we will become after we pass away from this body, which will be absolute
Hmm.
consciousness.
Hmm.
In the universal pool of consciousness,
Hmm.
which is in fact in a potential state,
Hmm.
not in a manifest
Hmm.
state. So while we are here in the form we are, we
Hmm.
need to meet physical wants. We need to have societies in which
Hmm.
we collaborate, cooperate,
Hmm.
and live and work. So, yes, understanding our individuality
Hmm.
as embodied spirits, but we
Hmm.
have the problem is not the individual, each individual. It's
Hmm.
when we don't know the nature of that individual.
Correct.
That's the
Hmm.
problem.
Hmm. Right. An allied question, and now is comes the KNOTTY question, really, Professor. So we teach, and we have been discussing for some decades now in India, and we teach this lecture in JGU as well, by Tagore on nationalism in India.
Mhm.
Now, the question is not pertaining to the title; it's more about the lecture, and maybe I should rather refer to Tagore's lecture on the crisis of civilization. Let's refer to that lecture instead of nationalism because that has a different epistemic connotation. So Tagore continuously talks about a kind of self-actualization which we are not aiming for. He doesn't use Maslow's vocabulary, let's say, of self-actualization, but he means pretty much that. And a lot of people find that idealistic. My question is to you not on Tagore, Professor. It is rather on the physicists, the quantum physicists that you are also very deeply passionate about. Richard Feynman,
Mhm.
Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg,
Mhm.
Albert Einstein. What do you think was their general perspective about the individual? What do you think? Uh, would you think they too had a spiritual side? Because people from an external lens would not view a physicist to be a spiritual person. They think these are two completely incompatible set of categories, spirit and physics. Whereas I think quantum physics is all about the spirit rather than matter. That's a different story.
Mhm.
So, what do you think was their worldview? Can we learn something from quantum
No,
physics?
absolutely. I think it is crystal clear. So
Hmm.
this one is not at all naughty in my view.
Yeah.
It starts with Max Planck.
Max Planck, okay.
And Planck is the first one who concluded. that the ultimate reality is consciousness
Okay.
from his work. So that was
Okay. So
clear.
you are saying that.
Yes,
You are saying that.
Max
Professor
Planck.
Naresh Singh is saying that.
I'm
I'm not
quoting
saying
Max
that.
Planck.
Okay. You're
He's not.
quoting Max.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's well established. So
Yeah.
Max Planck said that. Then let's go to Schrödinger.
Mm.
Schrödinger made the same conclusion after his own
Mm.
investigations and after writing his book, What is Life?
Mhm.
He came to the same conclusion. And then Heisenberg
Mhm.
came to the same conclusion on consciousness. It's amazing.
Mm.
Einstein has come to that conclusion when he said the only religion that I would believe in, is a religion of the spirit and the consciousness. So, my conclusion is that the real top class quantum physicists
Mm.
conclude on spirit and consciousness.
Right.
The average mediocre physicists
Mm.
are stuck in the material world.
Mhm.
That would be my somewhat, I guess, contentious conclusion.
Yeah.
But the
Which is
evidence,
which is not contentious at all, according to you.
no, but the evidence is clear. I'm citing these guys. I'm not imagining what they thought. They
Yeah.
said what they thought. They wrote it.
Yeah.
So, it's quite
Now,
clear.
the follow-up question might seem a little unfair, and but it's a question that I, for example, face, and I think there's a lot of censorship of what you just said because of multiple reasons. Maybe we don't know how to use this knowledge into wisdom. Maybe we don't know what to make of all these quantum physicists saying that the ultimate reality is consciousness. Maybe we feel perturbed that it comes so close to the wisdom of the Upanishads. Maybe we are not able to distinguish spirituality from science. We are not saying, surely you are not saying, people may accuse me of saying, but surely you are not saying that these are one and the same. I believe what you're saying is that scientists, going their independent way, found out consciousness to be extremely important, if not the only important no thing that we have in the universe. And spiritualists who do not know science, who do not practice scientific temper, through their meditative experiences, found out something very similar. This does not mean these are one and the same thing. But the question, Professor, is should we go about our own business, trying to do more research and trying to communicate about consciousness as being the only reality and trying to make a positive change in ourselves as well as our society? Or do we also have a right to communicate it to maybe our colleagues in the social sciences, in political theorists, cultural materialists, that materialism is extremely important, of course, because you said we are embodied individuals, but there are higher levels of reality. Do we have a responsibility to communicate that?
Well, I would say both a responsibility and an obligation. And that obligation arises because every time we generate knowledge,
Hmm.
every scientist, social, natural, whatever, academic,
Mm.
the reason we write and we publish is to share that knowledge and information that we get.
Hmm.
I guess we are motivated to do that because there are, rewards behind it,
Hmm.
either of tenure or financial rewards or whatever else. But at the bottom of it all, we are in the business of knowledge
Mm.
generation and production.
Mm.
And to have this knowledge and not to share, I think it's, if there's such a thing as sin, it's close to that.
Hmm.
However, we have to be careful how we do this. What I've learned in my own work is that attempting to persuade people who are not yet, who do minds have not yet been opened,
Hmm.
and who are so stuck in their own training, their own material nature, their own obsession with matter, they are they're cynical, and I don't mind the cynicism, but what I do mind is the lack of an open mind. For example, if I were to say, see, I was trained as a natural scientist,
Right.
and later in my career, I switched to the social sciences.
Right. And you, if you don't mind my interrupting, you also wrote your doctoral dissertation in the field of environmental
Hmm.
sciences. Right.
That's correct. And it was in the hard sciences, it was
Right.
chemistry. So,
Right.
so a lot of thermodynamics and kinetics, studying the behavior of toxic chemicals in the environment.
So we are talking to a scientist, not indeed entirely an economist. In
That's correct. Right. I didn't last too long as a scientist. When I say last too long, it was just my curiosity led me away.
Mm.
In fact,
your open mind.
I guess so. Curiously, I was just checking my Scopus author database the other day, and when I put in my name, I found three of my papers that I had written while I was a scientist. They are Scopus indexed, but I didn't find them for a long time. One, I wasn't interested until I became an academic. But they are published under the name of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It should have been under the Caribbean Environmental Health Agency. But that was fascinating. But anyway, coming back to what we are talking about, I think the issue here is there are enough people who are waking up.
Right.
Work with them. That's my approach now. And with them, you are going to grow the group, the core group of people, and the understanding will grow that way rather than waste time. But we have a kind of a captive audience as professors because with students, if you can make this language secular enough, it's reasonable to do and to teach. And one of the things I had to do before I started to teach this stuff in the university, in the academe, so to speak, was to answer the question, is inner knowing valid knowledge? Is inner knowing valid social science knowledge to be tested? Can it be published in a peer-reviewed journal? And the answer to that question is yes.
Oh, and that's quite radical.
Yes, and when we found that, very well.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. This is exactly the question that Swami Vivekananda also asked, by the way. When he had a debate about testimony, and in certain Western methods, right? In fact, even missionary methodology of conversions, testimony was not good enough knowledge, whereas it was, Swamiji believed that it is
testimony in the form of being a witness
to your inner change.
Yeah. Right. So I could have been quite happy sitting in my study in Ottawa, Canada, listening to classical music, drinking coffee, and having a time of my life, being with me. That is the highest fun that one can have. But I chose, after thinking hard about these things, I asked myself the question, should I disconnect from the world or should I go out in the world? And you just cited Swami Vivekananda.
Precisely.
Yeah. So I thought, let me go out in the world, but before I could teach, I had to be sure that what I was doing was consistent with academic standards of today. And having established, and we, colleagues at my center there, the CIAS, we found the work of the French philosopher, what's his name? His name escapes me at the moment, and people working with him, very well-known guy, who has written a lot on this business of inner knowing as social science knowledge. And when we found that, we were relieved. So our book called Applied Spirituality and Sustainable Development is a Scopus Index publication. We are just now, co-author myself, a young lawyer who is deeply engaged in this kind of work and thinking, Divesh Gupta, he and I are just sent to the publisher our manuscript entitled From Fragmentation to Wholeness. You can see the secular nature of the title, but the author, because our original contract included the word spirituality, and having written the book, we realized that we didn't need to use the word spirituality to say what we wanted to say. But the publisher said, that's in your contract. Find a way to keep that word because that's important for us.
So it's the publishers who are not trying to convert. It's the material that's now converting you to spiritualism. It's quite interesting.
I think they're thinking marketing, I guess.
That's a wonderful irony, Professor. So I mean, we have barely entered. We have barely started scratching the surface. That's what the note I started with,
Mm.
and the note I am going to restart with. I should say. Professor Naresh has some urgent business today, but we are going to be back very very soon. And Professor Naresh, in his own words, has re-entered the spectrum, so we are not going to leave him anytime soon. And this is only the beginning of a series, hopefully, that we've begun with Professor Naresh Singh under the rubric of the legends of philosophy of science. And hopefully, as we journey into this series, we'll hear more about quantum physicists and scientists of today. And until next time, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor Naresh.
Pleasure to be with you, Arup.